thank you for attending this lecture, and thank you particularly to Akram Najjar of Karazul Laymoun and Usama Nasser, a fellow old boy of my school, UPM, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm speaking from a beach chalet near Tripoli in North Lebanon, where my wife, our cats, and I have come to escape the bombing of Beirut, which goes on as we speak. This ongoing tragedy necessitates a better understanding of how we got here and may offer some inspiration, at least for someone and about someone I believe had the guts to challenge the establishment. That's a complex subject, but we will explore that later. Now, I think that before I start the lecture in full, I would like to have a minute's silence in honor of the latest victims of the butchery that we see unfolding on our screens. And really, perhaps how a talk about the aspects of perfidious colonialism is particularly apt when an act of colonialist butchery is unfolding now. So let's have a minute's silence for the people who are losing their lives and suffering now. Thank you. Allah yarhamon. May they rest in peace. And if anyone is interested in how they can contribute to ongoing relief efforts, we can talk later. I'm involved with some art therapy projects at the moment in Beirut. Now, some of you may know me as an artist and not as a professional historian. However, today I will try my best to be the latter. I will be exploring a little-known shared history of Lebanon and Britain, how we perceive it and what it means to us now. This touches me personally because I love both places and am interested in an episode which bridges two seemingly disconnected places. Britain has an extremely damaging history in the Middle East, notably with the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1915 between Britain and France, who carved up the old Ottoman Empire between them, the subsequent Balfour Declaration in 1917, leading to the mass slaughter and forced dispossession of the Palestinians from their homelands, and the creation of the State of Israel, which has accelerated now into a full-blown genocide. But the following episode may provide glimpses of a rare positive moment, a glimpse of inspiration perhaps, or at least a story which is more grey than black and white. Edward Louis Spears was born in France in August 1886. His English mother, Millicent Hack, suffered from severe mental illness, and this surely affected his troubled relationships with women throughout his life. After his mother was put in a mental asylum and later completely abandoned him, he was brought up by his grandmother Lucy Hack in Ireland and notably in France, in Provence, Burgundy, and Brittany. He grew up speaking perfect French. In 1906, he became a young officer in the British Army for the 11th Royal Irish Hussars. He became a liaison officer between Britain and France in the First World War, a role he really invented for himself, acting heroically and challenging leadership, which he felt was often incompetent and terribly wasteful of human life. It was on the Western Front when he met his wife, Mary Borden, when she was running field hospitals and writing poetry near the front line. We'll hear more about her later. His childhood and early career set him on a path which was to dominate his life, the struggle between Britain and France, both important parts of himself. He loved both countries, but never truly belonged to either. So why was Spears in Lebanon? In the beginning, it had nothing to do with any affection for the Lebanese. As ever, Lebanon was the unfortunate arena for other people's wars. And it seemed that France would, as it seemed certain that France would surrender to Nazi Germany. Spears was sent to France by his old friend Churchill, who he had met on the Western Front during the First World War, after Churchill was disgraced after the disaster at Gallipoli. And he was sent to France to find a French officer capable of leading a French resistance. Spears found a man called de Gaulle, a young officer who he thought was the man for the job, and persuaded de Gaulle to fly back to London with him in his small plane, taking off from Bordeaux Airport on June the 17th, 1940. Just a few days later, on June the 25th, France officially surrendered to Nazi Germany. And Marshal Pétain signed an armistice treaty with Hitler. The Nazi collaborators formed a government at Vichy, and as such, France's colonies, of which Lebanon and Syria were part, were now loyal to the Vichy regime, and by extension, the Nazi regime. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, began using Lebanon as a place to land their planes and support Rashid Ali's insurgency in Iraq against the British, which, if successful, would threaten the whole of the Middle East and North African theatres of war and the Eastern Mediterranean campaigns because of one thing: oil. Spears wrote, "Apart from Britain itself, the Levant seemed to me to be the most important theatre in the world. We drew essential oil from Iraq and Persia. The pipeline to Haifa was of the greatest importance. But if the Germans were to gain control of the Levant states, we would inevitably have lost the Suez Canal and Egypt, which was within an hour's flight of the Lebanese and Syrian landing grounds. This would mean the loss of the whole Mediterranean." So Spears led a campaign accompanied by his protege, de Gaulle, photographed here at the Ritz, who, as we mentioned earlier, he personally brought to London and persuaded the British to support and convinced Churchill and the British military command that the Allies must take Lebanon and Syria back from the Vichy Nazi control. Eventually, the invasion, Operation Exporter, happened in 1941. And after a vicious and absurd short war, which really amounted to a French civil war in the Levant, and in fact, Australian troops did most of the hardest fighting in the mountains, the British and Free French took control of Lebanon and Syria. It infuriated Spears that the French fought more bravely against their own countrymen in Lebanon than they had fought against the Germans in France. However, it must be mentioned here that de Gaulle, despite needing and depending on British patronage, was highly suspicious of British friendship. The so-called Entente Cordiale. On July the 3rd, 1940, at Mers al-Kabir in Algeria, British destroyers launched Operation Catapult to sink the French fleet, and nearly 1,300 French servicemen were killed by the British in an operation intended to prevent the fleet falling into Nazi hands after the Allied defeat in the Battle of France. And this followed on from a history of bad relations between the British and the French, most notably at Fashoda in Africa in the 19th century. Importantly, the Free French promised independence to Lebanon and Syria, and this promise was guaranteed by Britain. Displaying a distinctly imperial attitude to establishing influence in the region, particularly as the British were unpopular in Palestine for obvious reasons, Spears wrote, "How do we secure the goodwill of the people? It seemed to me that the most obvious, as well as the simplest way to do this, is to promise them independence in a manner that would carry conviction, so that they would forget how often it had been promised, but always withheld." But whatever the reasons for independence were, in Spears's mind at least, a British promise meant something. Spears was appointed head of the so-called Spears Mission to liaise between the Free French and the Lebanese and Syrian puppet governments, and later became the newly created British Minister for the Levant. He took residence, in this house in Zarif, in Ras Beirut, which became the British ambassador's residence from 1941 to 1985. Now, as you see on the left, as it was not that long after Spears's time, as a grey-coloured building, and it's now painted red, and is an administration centre for the social welfare institution Dar al-Aitam al-Islamiyya. Spears was accompanied by his wife, Lady Spears, Mary May Borden, a prolific American novelist and pioneering nurse who had set up field hospitals for French troops on the Western Front, and then for Free French troops across North Africa and Syria in World War II. Paradoxically, here she is with Charles de Gaulle, who was to become her husband's great nemesis, with her girls, the Spears girls, a famous gang of ladies who did heroic things across North Africa and the Levant. Earlier in her life, she had campaigned for the suffragette movement and spent a week in Bow Street prison for throwing stones at the Treasury Department windows in London. I will draw on her memoirs titled Journey Down a Blind Alley, which were published just a year after the war ended. As she had no political ambition herself, she perhaps recorded events a little less egotistically than her husband. Here she is in her role as a successful novelist and society hostess. Ah, that was the previous slide. Um, Now, she loved Lebanon. In her memoirs, she wrote about her compulsion to paint there. And actually, just behind me, although we can't see it at the moment, is one of her paintings of Lebanon, um, painted in 1942. When I closed the PowerPoint presentation, you can see it. Um, um, and um, she wrote about the um, the Lebanese landscape in a very romantic way. She wrote, I was in love with the land and the sky. I was in love with the wonderful, soft, full light that poured down round me and through me and seemed to fill not only my eyes with beauty, but my body with an essence that was life giving and had something to do with the source of pure happiness. And it wasn't just the landscape which captured her heart. She wrote, These people, the Lebanese people, are so much more like us than anyone in England imagines. Their Arabic names make them seem strange to those who don't know them. Now I feel that I do know many of them, and I find they have the same emotional reactions, the same ideas about decency that I have. They are gay, spontaneous, sensitive, and quick, where the British are solemn, phlegmatic, and have their sensibility under such control that they are about as vibrant as blocks of wood. um, Now, after the Allied invasion in 1941 and the defeat of the Vichy, the Spears took this house in Beirut as their residence. And it subsequently became the British ambassador's residence until 1985, when it became uninhabitable because of fighting in the Lebanese Civil War. Since then, it has been a centre for Dar al-Aytam al-Islamiyya, and first as an orphanage and then as an administration centre. Here it is just after the Spears' time, well, about 20 years, in 1964. And here it is now. In fact, with one of my paintings of the house superimposed. In fact, I was holding up the painting in the garden there. And here we go. I approached Dada Leighton in 2016 with an idea to do an exhibition there. I was given a lovely studio in the building by the director at the time, Khaled Abeni. Um, and here is another painting of the house, a more recent painting, showing its urban context. And flowers which I feel express the sort of spirit of the Lebanese, the sense of joy and exuberance, and also the spirit of the children who I worked with there. And here is the house again, furnished by Mary Borden, by Lady Spears. So we can see her taste here. And this is it during my time there, during my exhibition. And here is my studio in the house. And this room was most probably Spears's bedroom because it had the best ensuite bathroom, still with its beautiful fixtures and marble floors and marble bath, which must have been there in his time. So it was very evocative, painting there, and also studying there, where I read the biography of Spears written by Max Egremont, who actually came to visit me and the exhibition, and Levant by Philip Mansell, who is with us here this evening. And to read also the memoirs of the Spears in that very room was very powerful. And I painted there and also worked and painted with children who were cared for by the institution. Orphans from around Lebanon came to join me in the garden there, and we did a big exhibition in 2017. But sadly, a lot of the historical paintings I did about the very important history of the house were banned from the exhibition because the story was seen as too political and potentially controversial. This shows that the history is very much alive. It's not something that's finished. It's an ongoing, living process, particularly in Lebanon. I was told that the paintings may inflame French opinion, Francophone opinion amongst some elements of the Christian community, and may also anger more extreme Islamist and Syrian nationalist elements. And I was touching on something which in the end, I understood that, and we did an exhibition purely about architecture and architectural heritage. But the fact that the project was censored actually drove me on to dig deeper. So in a way, it was a blessing in disguise. Now, I'm just going to take a little detour here in terms of Lebanese history, because just a stone's throw from the house is another beautiful house, abandoned now. And this was the house where Fayrouz, the iconic Lebanese singer, grew up. And you can actually see the end of Fayrouz's garden from Spears's house. And they were living there at the same time. So you can only imagine a young Fayrouz watching Spears's magnificent car driving past with Union Jacks on the front, and you can only wonder what she must have thought of it. And here is a young Fayrouz on the steps of that house with a painting I made of those same steps. Now, here are some of the paintings that I made of political figures from Spears's time, from the time of Lebanese independence, but also some more recent figures of people who lived and visited the house. So the house, in a way, was the binding thread, really. And I painted some of the people who work there now. So I wanted to get a whole mosaic of people, rich and poor, Christian, Muslim, Druze, and French, British, and Lebanese and Syrian. But this was seen to be too controversial. So all of these portraits were removed by security. We move on now to another stunning building in Lebanon, which I have strong connections with. After Spears had settled in Beirut, he describes his first meeting with the French commander, General Catroux, who de Gaulle had appointed to be the French commander in the Levant, and the British commander Jumbo Wilson at the Sofa Grand Hotel, where I held an exhibition in 2018. Spears writes in his memoirs, the meeting between Wilson, Catroux, and myself took place in the hotel garden. The atmosphere was somewhat strained. And it wasn't just the French command which was the target of his wrath. Showing his barely disguised contempt for the British commander, Jumbo Wilson, he writes, he was an enormous, bold man, active for his size, unexpectedly so, like an outside child's balloon rising into space at the lightest touch. He had the good fortune to resemble a benevolent owl. Feathers alone were missing, but his physical characteristics were not a reliable guide to his character, and I personally never located the benevolence his wide paunch seemed to proclaim. In fact, the the British Foreign Office were regular targets of Spears's venom. Over the next 3 years, Spears's view of the French began to change as he witnessed their dictatorial and exploitative measures against the Lebanese. His main aim became the thwarting of French power in the Levant and support for the nascent Lebanese and Syrian independence movements. Now, here is Spears's own caricature sketch of de Gaulle, showing he was also an accomplished artist. And it says a lot about what he thought of de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle, whose main aim was to restore the greatness of France, seemed to have no intention of granting independence to Lebanon, as we saw later in Algeria. This set him on a collision course with Spears. De Gaulle said to the Foreign Office official Robin Hutchins, "It is we French who have given them their freedom, and it is for us alone to judge when they are fit to receive it." Ah. Now here you can see the relationship that Spears on the left had with the French, Catroux on the right. Now I'm just going to go back to the previous slide because that's another bit of architectural history in Beirut. This is the famous Rose House, or Pink House, as it's sometimes called, Beit el-Zahar in Ras Beirut. Now, a young Charles de Gaulle stayed here when he was an army officer in the First World War, or just after the First World War, after the French were given the mandate of Lebanon, and the state of Greater Lebanon was created, and the borders were drawn in 1920. And also in this house lived a fine lady called Faiza El-Khazin, whose father ran a law firm with the first president of Lebanon, Bashar el-Khoury. Faiza was born on the day that Lebanon won its independence, and she is called Faiza for that reason. Faiza means victory in Arabic, the equivalent of Victoria in English. Right, back to the struggle between the British and the French. Now, it must have been, in no uncertain terms, de Gaulle wrote to General Catroux, seen here on the right, on the 1st of May 1942. "You do not take any orders from a foreign general in any matter whatsoever," and you know who he's talking about. "In any case, persevere in your task of eliminating all British influence. It must have been hard for de Gaulle to give these orders, knowing that the existence of the Free French movement, at least at that time, depended entirely on British support. De Gaulle continues. Spears sees the establishment of a democratic parliamentary regime in Lebanon as a weapon with which to dispossess us. How interesting that the establishment of democracy in the Middle East was then seen as a destructive weapon. Spears was appalled by this attitude. He knew that it was mainly British and Australian soldiers who had defeated Vichy forces in 1941. He was also outraged that de Gaulle had kept many Vichy staff in control of Lebanon. Whilst his view of the French was deteriorating, what did he think of the Lebanese? Well, to begin with, he was equally scathing. In 1942, in a letter to the Foreign Office, he describes the pliant French stooge, President Nakache, and his so-called government. The two native governments, writes Spears, are hopelessly inefficient, especially the Lebanese. I have often likened people to chewed string in my time, but I have never met an individual characteristic of that article until I met President Nakache. But later, he was full of admiration, idealization, a romantic fascination. Something had changed. He wrote, the French could never have understood, still less accepted, that the Lebanese sprang from a far older and higher civilization than their own. He regarded them as shrewd and clever people. Now, this adulatory praise for one people, the Lebanese, could also turn the other way, as he showed distinctly racist attitudes towards Jews and Ghanaians later in his life, which, despite being typical of the time, are nonetheless shocking. So what went on at the house? Well, there were political meetings. And here is a picture of the house on the steps, on the front steps of the house, with Richard Casey, an Australian who was British Minister for the Middle East, and his wife, May. And both May Casey and Lady Spears were painters, and they used to go out painting together in Mount Lebanon. Here is Spears's biographer, and I discovered a lot of this from Max Egremont, who is Spears's biographer. Now, here is Spears and Casey and his colleagues in the hall of the house, which we saw photos of earlier. And from this photograph, I was able to place it with the Lebanese photographer Karim Sa'ar, superimpose it over a photo of the house as it is now and match it exactly so we could really know where they were standing in the room. Sadly, all of this archive material couldn't be shown at the exhibition because of political controversy. Now, we'll come on to her later. Now, from here and in his office, which is nearby, Spears orchestrated the fair distribution of wheat amongst rural areas to avoid the appalling famine which the Allies had caused in World War One, and also to strangle attempts by rich landowners to push up the cost of wheat by hoarding supplies. He also revitalized the Lebanese silk industry, reopening several deteriorating factories to make silk parachutes for the Allied armies that were used on D-Day in later 1944. And In fact, one of these very silk factories that Spears revived is now a concert hall in Fidar near Byblos. And a pianist friend of mine, Rupert Edgerton Smith, is coming over to Lebanon, hopefully, if the war, if there's peace, to perform a concert there later this year. Basically, Spears wanted to win the war, and he pursued any positive policy to this end. But even in 1942, he was worried and felt isolated. The American ambassador to Britain had called for his dismissal for fears he was supporting a local insurgent movement. In June 1942, the Foreign Secretary, Sir Anthony Eden, wrote to Churchill saying that Spears does not possess the right temperament for what is primarily a diplomatic post. Spears was aware of his vulnerable position. He wrote to Harold Catroux on the 8th of July 1942. The one thing that really puzzles me is London, and I have a horrid feeling that the strong attitude which was our characteristic, which was the characteristic of our policy towards the Free French and the Levant, has somewhat modified. I should very much like to be reassured on this point, as nothing is more difficult and discouraging that the feeling one may not be enjoying the full backing of London. In another letter, Sir Arthur Cadogan wrote about Spears. He is essentially an Ariviste. His primary object is to carve out a position for himself. This allusion to his vanity is backed up by several sources. Another secret telegram states that most of Spears's staff regarded him as an ambitious and unscrupulous self-seeker. But Spears still held the trump card of Churchill's support. Churchill announced, "Louis Spears has a great many enemies, but he has one friend." In this letter, Churchill wrote personally back to Eden, defending his man. Spears is very capable of standing up to French pretensions. Something which is clear from these plots to undermine Spears is that no one was considering the best interests of the Lebanese, apart from, it could be argued, Spears. His wife, Mary Borden, also did a lot to help the rural Lebanese and Syrians, setting up medical clinics to help the poor and diseased. She wrote, "Syria and the Lebanon are dear to me. The people have become my friends, and there is more beauty in their country than in any other I have known." One wonders how they must have discussed their work to help the local people. Now, I met his secretary, May Arida, who was 18 years old at the time, and vouches for the man she remembers as très charmant. Now, she went on to become the famous president of the Baalbek Festival, world water skiing champion, and the friend of most European royal houses. Now, I'm just going to take a little break now from my voice, and I think that we should hear something from her. I think it's very valuable to have an authentic Lebanese voice, the voice of a woman and the voice of someone who was actually there and knew Spears. So I'm going to just play this film. And by the way, there is a much longer version of this film with a more detailed interview with her about the struggle for Lebanese independence. But this is just a little glimpse.
Quand Spears est arrivé Après son séjour d'ambassadeur à Beyrouth, il était parti. Quand les événements, les Français ont arrêté, vous savez, le président de la République libanaise, Chamoun, le gouvernement, Habib Abu Shahla, Riad El-Solh, et tout ce monde a été arrêté. Alors, Spears est revenu à Beyrouth. Et il a habité chez Linda Surso, ma belle-mère. Il voulait une secrétaire en qui il pouvait avoir confiance. Alors mon mari, qui le connaissait très bien, lui a dit, voilà, ma femme vient d'avoir fait de Bachou. Vous pouvez compter sur elle. Il a dit, c'était bien. Moi, je vais avoir une conversation avec elle parce que je veux avoir vraiment quelqu'un de confiance. Bon, on a commencé. Alors elle me dit, écoutez, ma petite fille, je vais vous dire quelque chose. Peut-être vous allez trouver que ce n'est pas bien. La politique est une chose qui n'est pas bien. C'est une chose sale. Vous n'allez pas vous étonner. Si je dis, par exemple, à Abdelhamid Karame, je ne dirai pas la même chose à Chamoun. Alors ne vous choquez pas. C'est comme ça. On ne peut pas faire autrement. Et voilà ma rencontre avec Misfit. C'est quelqu'un, quand il était là, il parlait du Liban comme c'était une merveille. Il n'y avait pas seulement la question politique. C'était une personnalité extraordinaire.
Ah, the great May Arida, may she rest in peace. Um, so that was the last interview she gave just before she died. Um, and she really encouraged me to continue with this project. She felt it was important for Lebanon. Um, and well, here we are. I think she's with us in some way or other. Um, and now, as May Arida told me, and as I've read also in his diaries, and thanks to Philip Mansell and Max Egremal, Spears had a colourful private life. Um, Now, here is a photo of him relaxing. I think, yeah, here is him relaxing in the garden in Zarif with colleagues and his British mistress, Nancy Morris, um, who became his second wife later in life after Mary Borden died. Now, there is much evidence in his wife's memoirs about how much this ménage à trois upset her. Now, another woman who won Spears's affections is the well-known socialite beauty Maud Farjalla. In Samir Asir's seminal book Beirut, he describes Maud Farjalla as Spears's muse. In her memoirs, which I was provided with by the writer and historian Yusuf Mawad, who possibly is with us tonight, Visage d'une époque, she describes how Spears personally overturned and planned British occupation of her friend George Sider's mansion in Ras Beirut after she complained to Spears. Then she dined with him at Le Bain Militaire in Manara and then at the residence in Zarif. And she was given a guard of honor as she entered his house. Whatever their relationship was, it is clear that he had a great affection for her, as this letter he wrote to her from London shows. And there we can see also on the right is a letter written to her from I think it was General Paget of the Ninth Army, thanking her for her what she had done for the Allied war effort. Now, another woman who won Spears's affections was the singer Asmahan. Spears was passionate about her. He wrote this in his memoirs. She was and will always be to me one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. Her eyes were immense, green as the colour of the sea you have to cross on the way to paradise. There are several references in Lady Spears's memoirs to dinners and cocktail parties at Asmahan's house. The singer also visited the British residence many times. Spears describes one notable incident when she didn't show up. One night I was dining alone in the residence when the Arab butler informed me that the Emir Atrash wanted to see me urgently. Half an hour later, he appeared at the residence. I asked my butler to what I owed the honour of this urgent call. He then explained that his wife had telephoned asking for his immediate presence at the embassy. So that was it. She required the absence of her husband for reasons best known to herself, with the consequence that both he and I had been fooled into providing her with the time of which she no doubt made good use. Philip Mansell writes, she exploited the hostility between the British and the Free French and received a villa, a salary, and a cavalry bodyguard from the latter. It was said that in her bedroom you would find Air Commodore Kenneth Buss under the bed, General Evatt in the bed, and Spears hanging from the chandelier. Whatever happened between Asmahan and Spears, we shall probably never know. When she died in mysterious circumstances near Cairo in 1944, while shooting a film appropriately called Gharam ou Intiam, meaning love and vengeance, he was overcome with grief and went to the place where she was killed to lay flowers. Now, there are many theories as to why she was killed. All of them seem to be plausible. Possibly the Druze community, who were shocked by her decadent activities, possibly the British, because she was a double agent, possibly the French, possibly the Germans. We don't know to this day. Maybe we never will. Now, at Spears's insistence, free elections were held in 1943. The British-backed constitutional bloc, Dastour, defeated the French-backed National Bloc, and the new Lebanese government, with its first president Bashar al-Khoury and Prime Minister Riad El-Solh, had demanded full independence from France, and with Spears's backing refused to attend the Armistice Day parade. This is Jean Helle, the new French minister for the Levant, appointed by de Gaulle. And after Helle discovered that Lebanese deputies had not been invited to the Armistice parade and didn't show up, he was furious. In El-Solh and El-Khoury, Spears had found genuine voices for independence, and they themselves had formed what's called the National Pact, a power-sharing agreement which was never written down in a hotel in LA that year. Now, the Lebanese independence movement wasn't new. Arab nationalism actually had its roots amongst Lebanese Christians who desired to be free from Ottoman Muslim power in the 19th century. One of the most famous landmarks in modern-day Beirut is the Martyrs Square Monument, a sculpture honoring Lebanese nationalists hung by the Ottomans in 1916 after they found a list of Lebanese nationalists carelessly discarded by none other than George Picot. Now, here is Spears's house where he had many meetings with Catroux, de Gaulle, and Jean Helle, as we will see. Now, El-Solh, the son of a Lebanese Sunni Muslim Ottoman civil servant, had been inspired by the notable Algerian freedom fighter Abdel Khada and his own experience of being put on trial by the Ottomans. He had become a Lebanese nationalist after he abandoned the idea of a wider Syrian unity. El-Solh campaigned for Arab independence for many years and had been imprisoned by the French for his support for workers' rights. The French Mandate government sequestered his dear old childhood home on Beirut's seafront in Ain Maresi and sold it. The house was then demolished and replaced by apartment blocks. It broke El-Solh's heart. In Spears, El-Solh recognized a perfect ally that he could use to thwart the French. Not that he trusted the British either, particularly. El-Solh, like other smart Lebanese politicians, knew that Spears was a vain man and cleverly exploited this. When El-Solh was elected as Prime Minister, Spears wrote to Harold Macmillan, he is undoubtedly the best man among a very limited number of Sunni Muslims available. Spears knew that he had to appeal to the Muslim community as a way to create a fairer, more equal Lebanon, which was not completely dominated by Christians. He knew that Lebanon would never work otherwise. It wasn't just Sunni Muslims Spears had friendly contacts with, and this is particularly important when we consider the war going on today. He also courted the Shia community. And I know that he became great friends with the Oseidan family who live in Rameili near Saida, because I've had very enjoyable dinners with Ali Oseidan, who is the son of Adil Oseidan, or the son of Adil Oseidan, who was one of the independence leaders and Spears' friend. And the Oseidans vouch for the strong partnership and friendship. In fact, Ali Oseidan used to go on holidays to London as a boy and stay with Spears after Spears left Lebanon. So that gives you an indication of the way that Spears reached out to the Shia Muslim community and how important that is today. It was Spears who actually brokered a deal which created a fairer distribution of deputies in the Lebanese parliament, which nevertheless is still the cause of much discontent and dispute. A criticism often levelled at colonial powers is that they created weak states in order to continue dominating them. This may be true in many cases, but from what I've discovered about Spears and his Lebanese allies, they were truly trying to create as fair a system as they could at the time in order to make it strong. Of course, as we know, it has not turned out that way, and the confessional system needs a radical update. El-Solh, in turn, knew how to keep Spears on his side. He met with Spears and his political officer Furlong every day. He wrote a note to Spears expecting to be backed up in a dispute with the French. In carrying out the task I have undertaken, I am counting on support of all the friends in Lebanon, of whom you are the very first, wrote El-Solh. El-Solh and Bashar al-Khoury had formed a unique partnership of Christian and Muslims known as the National Pact. Religious division had been enshrined in Lebanese politics after a sectarian quota system was established in 1861 by, you guessed it, Britain, France, and Russia and the Ottomans after Christian Druze massacres in Mount Lebanon. El-Solh and Oseiran ultimately wanted to transcend and abolish the confessional system, whereby people's identities and politics are defined by their religion, are not defined by their religion. But to begin with, they knew they had to play the game in order to get in power. So a government was formed, which El-Solh felt was as fair as possible, with all religious groups sharing power. Importantly, and shortly before elections, de Gaulle had replaced General Catroux, with whom Spears had developed an uneasy yet working relationship with Jean Heller. Now we'll go back to him. He was the former Vichy ambassador to Turkey, and Mary Borden describes this change as a calamity. Heller had no grasp of the local situation. Spears described him as he writes, a very undistinguished and typical alcoholic. He made me think of an anteater because of his long nose, which, unlike that of the animal, was red at the tip, but seemed forever to be sniffing for something. On the 10th of November, there was a dinner at the Spears residence with King Peter of Yugoslavia and Jean Heller. Spears writes, I told Heller that I would like to have a word with him. The house was not very convenient for such occasions as this, with a large, barely finished hall on the first floor, on to which gave two rather small drawing rooms, not very elegant. But I took Heller into the right-hand room, which we called the green room. And here is my painting of that room that he's talking about. And from the window of that room, we can now see the bullet-scarred ruins of the Holiday Inn, which became the central battleground in the early stages of the Lebanese Civil War, 1975. Now, would Heller give him his word that fateful night on the 10th of November 1943 that there would be no precipitate French intervention? The delegate quickly assented. Je vous donne ma parole d'honneur. I give you my word of honour. Afterwards, May saw her husband's obvious relief. It did not last long. In the early hours of the morning of 11th of November, Spears awoke to find the eldest son of President El-Khoury in his bedroom. His face was covered in blood. The boy said that soldiers had entered his parents' room where his mother was ill in bed and dragged his father off, also beating the boy with the butts of their rifles, shouting, "Son of a dog, son of an Englishman." The president had called out to him as he was carried off, "Go to General Spears and tell him." The French had arrested most of the Lebanese cabinet, and imprisoned them in Rashaya Castle in the eastern Bekaa Valley. The three ministers had managed to escape and set up a temporary de facto independent government at Chamoun, assisted by armed locals and a number of women. May Arida kindly gave me this photo of which features her mother on the right. Now, Spears writes from the residence. It was now nearly 7 o'clock, and I telephoned Casey in Cairo and told him what had occurred. He could just not believe the French had been so insane. But we both agreed that we must react immediately. As we spoke on the phone, Heller's voice came on the air, on the radio, declaring that he had suspended the constitution, dismissed the government, and appointed Emile Edde as head of the new government. Now, there is a link here which I discovered, which is a personal link. And I had always wondered, what connection did I have, if any, to this story? When I first came to Lebanon, I felt a great attachment to the country, a very emotional connection, but I was not aware that, in fact, there was a connection. Because in her book, I will go back to the slide. This is a copy of the page of her book, published just after the war, Journey Down a Blind Alley, when she describes the morning after when they awoke to discover that the ministers had been imprisoned. And perhaps you can screenshot this if you like. I mean, it's brilliantly written. And she writes, I took up the phone by his bed, Spears's bed, her husband, B, which was her nickname for him, which was in fact short for Beaucaire, which is a French character in a play. B went on talking. Colonel Isham is coming down from the Ninth Army. There'll be others. We'll want breakfast, coffee, anyhow. Now, Colonel Isham was my mother's cousin. And in fact, I grew up playing in his garden in Northamptonshire, England. And I knew him quite well as a child. And in fact, my parents met in his house. And here is Colonel Isham, as an older man when I knew him, with his black Labrador. And there's a great cedar of Lebanon in the garden. I was amazed to discover that this uncanny connection. He, in fact, was one of the General Spears's advisors during the independence crisis in Lebanon in 1943. And in fact, my mother, she died when I was 10, is buried in the churchyard at the end of his garden. So, you know, the closer I looked at the story, the more stories I discovered within stories. Now we go back to, and I might as well mention that Colonel Isham had also been a Hollywood actor before the war, and acted in the production of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina alongside Greta Garbo. Back to Rashaya Castle. So this is the castle in the eastern Lebanese town of Rashaya, where the French imprisoned the Lebanese government. Now, later that day, on the 12th of November, Spears invited Riad El-Solh, wife of the president, to come and stay in the residence, where he gave her protection. Um, Here's Laura El-Khouri. My wife visited Madame Khouri, the wife of the president, that afternoon, writes Spears, and found her terrified. Black Senegalese troops had previously killed several people outside the house who had formed a part of a peaceful delegation. The long flight of steps outside the president's residence were running with blood when my wife arrived. Madame Khouri implored to be given a British guard, but as this was impossible, I offered her and her children the hospitality of the house. Spears describes how the house was like a railway station, a centre of activity and meetings about independence. Now, deputations poured in, among them the Maronite Archbishop of Beirut, the Muslim Grand Mufti, and Madame Zelpha Chamoun. And here she is, well, my painting of her. Spears describes her entrance into the residence that day. In tripped Madame Chamoun, fair as a ripe wheat field in sunshine, her immense blue eyes ablaze, whose husband, the pro-British Camille Chamoun, had also been seized. The next day, both Spears and his wife were particularly inspired by the massive women's march led by Zelpha Chamoun of Christian and Muslim women, which took place on the streets of Beirut on the 12th of November, just down the hill from the house. Spears writes about the Muslim women who took part. They were saying that they were Lebanese women, just women who loved their country as much as did their Christian sisters, and they demanded freedom for their country and the release of their leaders. No more were they to be helots of an alien race. They were simply Lebanese demanding the freedom they had been promised. They marched to Spears's office and, I quote, left me with the following message for the Prime Minister Winston Churchill. His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, we Lebanese ladies of different creeds strongly protest about the hideous aggression and treachery committed against the officials of our independent government, which independence has been recognised by HBM's government and by the Allies, and regard this as an insult to our liberty, which you protect and fight for. We ask for your immediate intervention in the interests of safeguarding the rights of weak nations, which you have often declared, and especially at the Moscow conference, to be their protectors, from the ladies of the Lebanon. Riad El-Solh's daughter, Yusr, recalled how Spears told her, a country that produced such splendid women deserved to be free. Mary Borden writes about the ladies of the Lebanon movement. What interests me most is the behaviour of the women. It cost them something to go out into the streets and make a public spectacle of themselves. Nor could they know that the black Senegalese troops bearing down on them wouldn't shoot. I know they achieved one thing, and I believe that although the first fine frenzy has dwindled, it will last. They achieved a national unity. They brought to birth a united spirit, and I do not think it will be easy to snuff out. All this attention surely pressurised Spears to act. Now, here is a photograph of that women's march captured by British Pathé News. Now, this was his moment of glory. Here he is looking comfortable, very comfortable with Lebanese politicians, next to Sabri Hamedi on the left and Riad El-Solh on the far right. One can only imagine how this must have played into Spears's vanity, as you can see here, rather pleased with himself, and desire to be thought of as the successor to Lawrence of Arabia. Something that his biographer Max Egremont claims was in his sights. The British establishment, however, were not impressed by his behaviour. Duff Cooper, British ambassador to the Committee of French Liberation, had written to Churchill after a visit from Spears's wife. He writes, she and her husband believe that the main objects of their mission is to maintain the rights of the native populations of the Levant against the dominant power, and even encourage the natives to assert these rights. This is not my view, nor the view I believe of His Majesty's government. For me, this is what makes him a compelling figure. Um, Here he is with both the British and the Free French military. He was certainly mixed up in a dirty rivalry between Britain and France, he affected an arrogant imperial air, but he showed empathy and compassion for, I quote from him, a small and defenceless people, the Lebanese. For a British general of the time, this was unheard of. On the 13th of November, matters got worse. French troops killed 11 peaceful protesters in Tripoli. In fact, just a few miles from where I am speaking now. Peaceful protesters at the AUB were fired upon. And here is a painting that I made from that photograph, overlaid. And here is a contemporary, here is a photo of the AUB at the time, where protesters were fired upon too by the French. The crisis was also close to Spears's residence. He writes, in Beirut, the French had kept the nearby Muslim quarter of Basta practically in a state of siege, not allowing the people to leave their houses. This led, in many cases, to a desperate shortage of food. The British Army commander told the French general, de Lavalade, that the French must distribute food, otherwise the army would do so. The French immediately complied. Now, the moment came to a head when Spears and his colleague Casey felt they had to make an ultimatum to General Catroux, the commander of the French forces. The letter they wrote reads as follows. In the opinion of His Majesty's government, it is essential that the persons mentioned should be released from Roshire Castle and reinstated in the offices they held before the recent crisis caused by their imprisonment. If the President of the Republic and other Lebanese ministers have not been released at 10 a.m. on the 22nd of November, they will be set free by British troops. It is this letter which defines the date of Lebanese Independence Day. The ministers were released and independence was announced. This picture speaks for itself. Spears is wearing the same white suits as the Lebanese, but the French General Catroux is in uniform, not looking so happy. In fact, the episode reminded him of Fashoda, an incident on the Sudanese border in 1898 when the British threatened the French and military force in East Africa if they didn't remove their forces from the Upper Nile. The French had never forgotten it. And here is a painting, that painting of the Day of Lebanese Independence, which I attempted to exhibit in the house in Zarif, but it was removed. Now, here is the sketch of the first flag of the Lebanese Republic. It was first drawn by members of Parliament and Henri Faraon in Saib Salam's house in Masaitbi, so the story goes, and agreed upon by the deputies of the Lebanese Parliament. Saib Salam was Spears's hunting partner, as told to me personally by Salam's son and recent Prime Minister of Lebanon, Tamam Salam, and after I painted his portrait, to say thank you for his patronage of the Rose House exhibition. That day in Martyrs Square in Beirut, crowds celebrated independence. That night, there was a ball to celebrate. And in Beirut, Spears spoke of freedom. I am certain of little Lebanon's welcome among the noble company of those who have dared all for freedom, and who, refusing to accept defeat, are witnessing at last the dawn of the day of triumph, a victory won at the cost of such blood, many tears, and great sacrifice. Stokes, Spears's deputy, wrote, "Everyone is hysterically happy because for the first time in the history of the whole of Lebanon is united, Christian, Muslim, and Druze. Spears is the absolute hero of the day, an inspiration in the struggle for freedom." But the British government were not so amused. Churchill fired him. And here is the original letter Churchill wrote him. Foreign Office reports from the time are littered with criticisms and plots to have him sacked. Government staff hated his unorthodox methods and vanity. A Foreign Office memo titled "How to Get Rid of Spears" was written only 2 months after Spears helped Lebanon become independent. Another note states, "I'm afraid that there is no doubt Spears is a complete misfit." Hence the title of this lecture. To stand up for the rights of a small nation was dangerous to the whole concept of empire, British and French alike. Churchill personally warned Spears, "We should discourage the throwing of stones, since we have greenhouses of our own, acres and acres of them." However, Churchill did give him the honour of at least appearing in public to have resigned. Churchill wrote to him, and here I show you the letter again, and you can see that he wrote, "I had great difficulty in securing your return to your post. You did not take my advice to try to keep your Francophobia within reasonable bounds. I will, however, arrange that, when the time comes, you will be given the opportunity of asking to be relieved instead of being abruptly superseded. That is the best I can do." You can see here that Churchill didn't mention the rights of the Lebanese once, and didn't even consider them. He was really just considering our relationship with the French, which is understandable considering that they are the neighbouring country to Britain, and also we needed de Gaulle on our side before D-Day. And the culmination of the Second World War. So you can see here a classic case of how Lebanon is caught up in the as an arena for the conflicts of much bigger states, which goes on obviously as we speak. Now, on that note, I'm going to move on to one of Spears's more controversial qualities, and that is his passionate anti-Zionism. And he argued, according to many letters and documents that I've discovered in St Anthony's College, Oxford, where the Middle East papers are kept, he argued with Churchill about the establishment of the State of Israel. He called British lies to the Arabs, I quote, "immoral and nasty." Despite the fact that his paternal grandparents were Jewish from the Alsace region between France and Germany, he always denied he had Jewish blood. However, his background made him the victim of anti-Semitism throughout his career, and many believe that this was an important reason why he was so anti-Zionist, or wished to be seen as so by the Anglo-Saxon establishment. In 1947, he received a letter bomb from a Zionist extremist, angry at his opposition to a Jewish state in Palestine. His habit of passing on interesting stamps to his cousins who collected them saved him, because a closer look at the parcel revealed the ominous wires. Now, Mary Borden also had strong humanitarian views about what was happening in Palestine. In 1948, she was involved in setting up the Anglo-Arab Relief Fund to help Palestinian refugees. In a strongly worded letter of appeal, she warned that the troubled story of Palestine is not finished. What we are watching from a comfortable distance is not the end, but the beginning of a tragedy that is going to affect the history of the world. This has come to pass, as we see now. The attitude of both Spears and his wife cannot have done him any good with the British establishment. And Churchill wrote to Spears on the 28th of January 1945, "It is not correct that you take a position which is hostile to the government by whom you are still, in effect, employed." He continued to argue with Churchill about Zionism. And how could Churchill risk having such a liability in such an important position in the Levant, who was actively expressing views in contradiction to official British policy and in contradiction to the original Balfour Declaration? In his 2008 essay, Rory Miller writes, "Unlike many of his anti-Zionist contemporaries who accepted a Jewish state as a fait accompli, Spears continued his anti-Zionist agitation in the years after Israeli statehood. Indeed, if anything, the ferocity of his anti-Zionism only increased with the founding of Israel. In 1953, for example, he was publicly condemning Israel as a cancer in the heart of the Arab Middle East, an inoperable cancer, I fear. And he continued to argue about the Jewish state in this manner until his death in the 1970s. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions from that. About Lebanon and the French, he wrote, "By abandoning the idea that these people were inferior slaves, and by treating them instead as human beings, the French quite soon established good relations with the Lebanon. Then, at last, I could say that the mission given to me by Churchill had been fulfilled." You may well wonder, what on earth was a British general doing deciding what should happen in Lebanon? What right did he have to be here in the first place? What were the British and the French doing competing for power in the Levant at all, meddling in the affairs of others? These are valid questions. There can be no doubt that the actions of these two countries did much damage. But I think we have to see him in the context of his time and consider the best parts of what he wanted, that no people of another country should decide what happens to Lebanon in future, apart from the Lebanese themselves. This is a vital thing to consider today. Whether he really meant this, or whether what he really wanted was more British economic influence in the Levant, is open for debate. I think elements of both are true. However, the notion, however idealistic, that Lebanon should be self-reliant is an important issue to reconsider now. The struggle for Lebanon's independence cost Spears both his comradeship with de Gaulle and his treasured friendship with Churchill. In the end, as D-Day approached, and due to British fears that France may fall to communists after the war, to keep the French on side was far more important consideration in Churchill's mind than Little Lebanon. Spears lost his post. He was useful as a way to curry favour with the Lebanese in the heat of the moment, but once this had been achieved, he was discarded. After his dismissal, he returned to England with his diplomatic career in ruins, and he lost his seat as an MP for Carlisle at the next general election. He spent the rest of his life in business, managing a gold mine called Ashanti in Ghana, and chairman of the Institute of Directors in London. But he never lost his love of Lebanon. He returned to Beirut to a hero's welcome in 1946 after the war and regularly entertained Lebanese friends in London, including May Arida and the Chamouns, regaling everyone on his wonderful achievements. When he died in 1974, a delegation from the Lebanese government attended the funeral. Mercifully, perhaps, he never saw the country which was the site of his greatest achievement get torn apart in a vicious civil war. And likewise, he never witnessed the other country he did so much for, Syria, also descend into the hell we are witnessing now. Appropriately enough, there is a cedar of Lebanon in the churchyard in England where he is buried, in Warfield, Berkshire, southwest of London. He is buried next to his wife and their only son, both of whom died 5 years before him. Strangely, his wife's tomb is the only one which mentions their close ties to Lebanon and Syria. But his resting place is in a sad state. The tombstone is untended and falling over. We love a hero, a maverick who stands out from the crowd against many odds, struggling for what appears to be right. In many ways, Spears fits the bill, but in other ways, he is not so likable. Was he really interested in the rights of the Lebanese, or just doing anything to win the war against Germany and spite the French in order to further British colonial and economic interests and ensure that the British pound sterling became the reserve currency and currency which was used in the Middle East? Was he just an accidental champion of Lebanese independence? Whether he meant to or not, his actions led to the first crack in the whole edifice of European colonialism. After Lebanon, many countries in the region and around the world won their struggles for independence. This, it could be argued, is his vital legacy. But there is another way of looking at these momentous events. The British Lebanese researcher Helen Kazan writes, it becomes clear following the end of the war that aid from Britain in the reconstruction process, as well as the free trade agreement given in independence, becomes a way to gain influence in the governance of these soon-to-be nation-states. This is revealed in the following sinister passage from a top British secret report, Notes on Post-War Settlements in the Middle East, published on the November the 15th, 1942, which states, this system is necessitated by the fact that we have declared independent certain small Middle Eastern states, which are incapable of independence. Thus, the representatives of His Majesty's government in these countries are faced with a situation of quite extraordinary difficulty. With little or no official standing, they must really dominate and control these countries from behind the scenes. We are dealing with an entirely new and unprecedented method of control. Control by influence is a new art, which all who serve in these countries must learn, says the report. Basic features characterizes the situation in Arabia today, the division of the Arabs into two classes, the governing and the governed. Many now argue with good reason that the breaking up of Middle Eastern states into pliant and hopelessly dysfunctional nations within artificial borders designed by Western powers set the scene for endless chaos, which would pave the way for an eventual takeover by a powerful and brutal force which could dominate the whole region. I mention no names, but I'm sure you know who and what I'm referring to. Whether this comes true is a battle being fought out now. I think today's Lebanon would have both horrified and delighted Spears. His attempts to help Riad El-Solh and others establish a fairer way of sharing power across religious divides quickly mutated into a dysfunctional sectarian system whereby corrupt politicians fan the flames of division, pocketing huge sums of public money, and leave the country to descend into a desperate environmental crisis. And his political ally in Lebanon, Riad El-Solh, was murdered in Amman in 1951 by an SSNP Syrian nationalist gunman, Michel Aldik from Tripoli, North Lebanon, where I am now, with help from the British, according to some reports, which have never been properly declassified. Now, this could be viewed as a classic case of redaction, whereby the powers that be protect themselves from public prosecution. Does this ring any bells? Lebanon also hosts up to 1 million refugees from Palestine and now Syria, putting an enormous strain on an already fractured society. But the country still enjoys a great degree of creative freedom, which is unique in the region, and as I know, is a great place to be an artist. Now, however we judge him, this extraordinary character, full of contradictions, who contributed significantly in both world wars, provided vital support for the man who eventually created modern France, de Gaulle, and then did so much to win an independence for Lebanon and Syria, is now largely forgotten by the British. He is only remembered in Beirut by this building in Ain Maraisi, the Spears building, which was his office, and also by this street, one of the main streets in Hamra, in Ras Beirut, named after him. And the street was just down the hill from his house. But few people in Lebanon know why the street has this name, or what momentous events happened in his house just up the hill near the street. Mary Borden wrote at the time, using the nickname B for her husband, "What is to come of it all? This, Lebanon, is a backwater now. All the big issues are being decided elsewhere. No one at home is interested in the Arabs. B will get no thanks, whatever happens, for what he has done here." For many reasons, and despite all of his glaring faults, I think that should change.